Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the CUNY Graduate Center. We encourage you to check our webpage and sign up for our newsletter to keep abreast of our activities and events. We'll be posting that information in the chat for you. A recording of this event will also show up on our website, not immediately after this event, but as soon as we are able to post it. The event we planned for today will last for just about an hour. After I introduce our speakers, they'll engage in about a 40-minute long dialogue, after which we'll open things for questions and comments. We've decided that we will stop recording then to let people feel free with commenting. So before I introduce our speakers, I would like to note that the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics and the CUNY Graduate Center are located on the ancestral land of the Lenape peoples, past and present. Okay, to introduce our speakers, Elan Abrell, the author of this book, is a cultural anthropologist whose research focuses on human-animal interactions, environmental justice, and food-related technological innovation. Elan is currently a visiting assistant professor of environmental studies at New York University and will be joining the faculty of Wesleyan University as an assistant professor of the practice in environmental studies and a core member of the Animal Studies and the Science and Society program. He was formerly a 2017-18 Farmed Animal Law and Policy Fellow at the Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard University and a visiting assistant professor at the Urban Studies Department at Queens College, CUNY. I also want to note that he's a graduate of the CUNY Graduate Center of the Anthropology Department, which is a close friend of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Lori Gruen is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University, where she also coordinates Wesleyan Animal Studies. Her work lies at the intersection of ethical theory and practice, with a particular focus on issues that impact those often overlooked in traditional and ethical investigations: women, people of color, non-human animals, incarcerated people. She's published extensively on topics in animal ethics and ecofeminist philosophy. She's the author and editor of 15 books, including Ethics and Animals, An Introduction, Entangled Empathy, and Critical Terms for Animal Studies. Her current work includes unpacking carceral logics by exploring the ethics of abolition. She has a co-edited volume called Carceral Logics with Justin Marceau and a co-authored monograph called Animal Crisis with Alice Crary. Okay, I turn it over to our speakers. Thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And thanks Lori for joining me in this discussion. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Elan, for writing such an important and interesting book that we'll talk about today.
Cool. So I think we were going to start by talking about what sanctuaries are for people who are new to the concept. And I think there's a lot of different ways that you can define sanctuaries, or there's different ways that the term is used. The way that I conceptualized it, and I think a pretty common one for people who run sanctuaries in the book, is places of spaces of captivity where animals that were rescued from conditions of mistreatment or violence or exploitation are cared for and given good lives. And so there are a lot of different kinds of sanctuaries that I think you could sort of categorize around the kinds of animals they care for, because that really impacts the way that they operate and the decisions they have to make. So farmed animal sanctuaries are maybe the most well-known ones to people who are aware of sanctuaries, and those are for animals that were formerly farmed or rescued from agricultural contexts. But there's also sanctuaries for captive wildlife, animals that were not domesticated but ended up in human captivity anyway, like anything from big cats to primates to tropical birds. And then a space that I look at in the book also, which not usually called a sanctuary, but there are sanctuaries for companion animals, but I look at a companion animal rescue organization, like a shelter that is a no-kill shelter that's rescuing cats and dogs and finding homes for them. And then, of course, there's also things that you might hear the term used sometimes to refer to, like a wildlife refuge or a space in nature that's set aside for animals that live there. I conceptualize that as something a little different, because it's not really captivity. It's maybe animals that were living in the wild, and so it's just a protected space. And then There's also sanctuaries for primarily for specific kinds of animals, like there's some just for horses. And then Lori has a lot of expertise with sanctuaries for primates. So maybe you want to say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to think about when thinking about sanctuary is that they are both sites of care for animals that have come from conditions of, as you said, exploitation and violence often. But they're also important places that can sort of help us to reimagine our relationships with other animals. And in my own experience, although I have a lot of connection to sanctuaries for farmed animals, I also have a lot of experience with the National Sanctuary System for Chimpanzees, which is called Chimp Haven. And Chimp Haven is a place where the chimpanzees that are government owned, which is, and you talk about this in the book as well, but there are two kinds of chimpanzee populations in the United States. In laboratories. Some of them are privately owned by the laboratories, and some of them are publicly owned, meaning the government owns them, meaning we own them, taxpayers own them. And Chimp Haven is a sanctuary that came into existence in a very unique way through an act of Congress, through the Chimp Act, and it is funded by tax dollars to retire the chimpanzees that were government-owned chimpanzees that were used in laboratories. And so that's a very different kind of sanctuary that is a federally owned sanctuary, as it were. It's not actually completely federally owned, but it's primarily federally funded, which is a very different kind of thing than most of the sanctuaries that we'll be talking about and that you talk about in the book, because those sanctuaries rely on donations and other kinds of support to care for the animals that are in their space.
Mm-hmm. And I should probably add too that the term can be misused or co-opted. It's sometimes used by what are essentially roadside zoos to characterize themselves as something a little more animal friendly. And so there's an organization, there's a few accreditation organizations, I think, but the most well-known one is the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. And they have specific definition of what a sanctuary is, which is not a for-profit private zoo. And you can, especially for sanctuaries outside of the farmed animal sanctuary movement, you can often see that they will have that accreditation. It doesn't, for reasons that don't reflect badly on farm sanctuaries, they just are, there's been less of a take up of a need for accreditation, that particular organization there.
One other thing I wanted to say about sanctuaries that I think is something that you bring out in the book, and I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about it, is that for many sanctuaries, it's not just the care and rescue that it goes on site, but there's also a mission, an educational or advocacy mission that's tied to the work that the sanctuary does. And I know that's a very important feature of the work of sanctuaries, because obviously, let's say in the farmed animal realm, there are billions of animals that are used and killed in that system. And there's just a small number of animals that can actually be rescued and cared for in sanctuaries. And so part of the idea of sanctuary is, obviously, there's no possibility of rescuing every farmed animal. That's very different than the chimp sanctuaries, where the goal is ultimately, even though it's a failed goal at this point, the goal is ultimately to get the chimpanzees out of the laboratories. But in the case of farmed animals, that's not the goal, because it's an impossible goal. And it's not a failure of sanctuaries that they can't do that massive rescue work. So I wondered if you would say a little bit more about that, Elan, the advocacy and messaging and education role of sanctuaries.
Yeah, I think that you're right. That's reflected really strongly in farmed animal sanctuaries. Every single one I'm aware of has an education program that teaches the public about the treatment of farmed animals in industrial animal agriculture, what happens to them, the effects of selective breeding on their bodies, all of the conditions under which they're kept, just the sort of like the entire horrible experience of being an animal caught up in industrial animal agriculture. And so the ones that do tours will explain this as they guide people around the sanctuaries. Not all sanctuaries are open to the public or do tours, but even the ones that aren't still have advocacy missions and have social media presences and hold conferences and educate people about the conditions in that way. And I think, so like, there's a article about farm sanctuaries that came out several years ago by Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson, where they sort of described this as the refuge and advocacy model. And they set up the model in order to compare it to like an alternative model that might be a more collaborative community model. And I think that there's some accuracy in that because all these sanctuaries do advocacy work. But I also think that there's a way in which all sanctuaries are doing a more abstract kind of advocacy work, in that they're modeling, like you said at the beginning, Lori, these new ways of trying to live together with animals that cannot live separately from humans. And I think there's a critique that's made of the advocacy model sometimes that it's not necessarily having, well, on the one hand, the refuge part is having almost no impact in terms of numbers, as you described, although I think it means very much to the animals who are being rescued. But then on the other hand, that the advocacy model itself might not be particularly influential because sanctuaries are specific, like geographically located in specific places, often outside of cities. And so maybe they're not directly impacting people as much as other methods for advocacy might be. But I think that misses the important role that sanctuaries play in this moment in history as this movement for trying to find new ways to live together with the environment and with animals, and sort of demonstrating that there are methods for doing this, for a form of activism for trying to think differently about how we're going to navigate the future. And I think so sanctuaries are doing this sort of like important cultural work as well as the direct advocacy work.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and I also think that, as I was suggesting, I think there's a really important, and not all sanctuaries do this well, but I think many of the best sanctuaries are very much committed to helping the wider public to reimagine our relationships. And I think that that's really a fundamental part of sanctuary work beyond the care and rescue. That is the core mission. I wanted to go back to this question, this word that you used, and a concept that's so important to think about in the context of sanctuary talk, and that is the idea of captivity. So sanctuary is, you started by saying, is a captive space, and I think that raises some interesting and difficult questions, ethical questions about the mission of sanctuary. Can you have this reimagining of our relationships with other animals in an ethical and politically savvy way, while at the same time recognizing that these are conditions of captivity? They're better conditions of captivity than those that the animals are rescued from, but they are nonetheless conditions of captivity. And in my work, I define captivity not just as an enclosure of sorts, of various sorts, but also being enclosed, having your freedom of movement limited in some way, but also being reliant on human others to care for your basic needs. And I think that if you understand captivity in that way, sanctuaries are sites of captivity, but there are fundamentally different sites of captivity than, say, prisons or slaughterhouses, feedlots, even zoos, certainly laboratories. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about your sense of captivity, and then I'll say some more about that as well.
Yeah, I think that that's right, that it's even in the best possible imagining of how to organize a finite space like sanctuaries are, because they exist in the United States, where you have to have private property in order to have them in the first place, which means that your property is going to have boundaries. You can't create a sanctuary in which your cows and chickens and pigs can roam all across upstate New York, wherever they want, for example, because your neighbors might do something bad to them. So like there's like a physical boundedness to sanctuaries, but then also I think it would be impossible, at least if you lived in a place that has weather like I have right now, that there wouldn't be, to some extent, animals have to be dependent on humans for care as well, because they're domesticated species, and they're going to need food brought to them when there's no food to forage and things like that. But I think that, like you were describing, sanctuaries are working to try to minimize those sort of structures of captivity that you would find in ways of confining agency, ways of limiting freedom that are much more prominent in, well, you could compare it to zoos, where ostensibly the mission is not to kill animals, although some zoos do. Even then, they're like much more confined than they might be in sanctuaries. And so I was interested in both the way, well, I was interested in the ways that sanctuaries try to afford as much of that agency and freedom as possible to animals, even when they have to deal with these dilemmas of care, like a concern over safety. Sometimes certain species might not get along with each other. I was at a sanctuary where there were both chickens and a capuchin monkey who wanted to hunt birds, and he would set up little bits of food along the edge of his enclosure to attract birds, and both wild birds and chickens, and then he would grab them and pull them in. And so they had to reorganize the space, so the chickens didn't have free range around that area anymore, and they had to live in a different place. And so you run up, I'm fascinated by these moments in which caregivers try to accommodate the freedom or the agency of animals as much as possible, while also having to make these hard decisions about how to potentially curtail it. Other examples are animals that make essentially friendships with each other across species. I write about a goat and a cow who became very close companions, but there was concern over the goats, that she was older than the cow, she was like a young calf when they first met, or bull, I guess I should say. And so there was concern that once he got to sort of adolescent bull size, when they're way over a ton and they're really rambunctious, that he might injure his goat friend. So they were sort of separated. And then they found a way to hang out on either side of the fence and graze together anyway. But, or another example is I write about a turkey who just didn't want humans around. And, in many situations of captive animal care like zoos, that's tough. Like, the animals are going to be forced to have humans around regardless. But the sanctuary endeavored to give him his space and just leave him, not go in and bother him at all in the area that he was in, except for one caregiver who had found a way to sort of make herself smaller and carry herself in a way that he allowed her to come in without charging her and getting mad. Yeah, I think that there's this like conscious effort to try to mitigate the constraints of sanctuary as much as possible.
I think you raised two really important and challenging issues about the role that human captors can play in the context of even caring relations with their captives. And one of them, I think, is important to think about when it comes to these interventions that you're mentioning. I think there's a very difficult line to draw, and part of it has to do with the failure of our imagination to think, I'm just going to use the example you gave, to know that a cow and a goat can figure out their own boundaries, that they don't need humans to interfere necessarily in protecting one against the other. Now, clearly, there are moments when intervention's required. The capuchin monkey is a good example of how you have to. This monkey, and same thing with chimpanzees, they're going to harm other animals if the other animals aren't sort of prevented from interacting with them. So there's this question of interference, and when is it appropriate for humans to interfere with the animals in their care, and when isn't it? And of course, in some contexts, I know of one I would call pseudo sanctuary. It's trying hard to become a more respectable sanctuary, but sometimes fails, maybe too often than it should, where they used to believe that the best way of dealing with animals was to just leave them on their own. So they believed that human interference was fundamentally unethical, and in the process ended up leaving a number of captive animals in much worse conditions than they would have been had they been attended to by the humans who were ultimately their captors, even though the humans wanted to pretend they weren't, and that's why they didn't want to interfere. So I think there's a whole range of ethical questions that arise in the context of captivity about when and whether and under what conditions it makes sense to be interfering with the behaviors and the activities of the animals that one is caring for. And I think, I know these are all very situational. It's going to largely depend on the particular individuals and how important it is to get to know who they are and what their personalities are and what their likes and dislikes are. Part of that process, it seems to me, and you write about this as well, is a way of trying to sort of avoid the sort of more arrogant anthropocentrism that comes with the work that humans often engage in, thinking that we obviously know best, when in fact there might be a completely other perspective that the animals have, and they can figure out their relationships without our managing them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. That I saw that in different ways. People endeavoring to try to understand both the unique aspects of a particular species being, like what kind of interests an animal just by virtue of being a particular species might have. For example, the sanctuaries that there were zebras, they would get really uncomfortable if they didn't have a far line of sight. So the sanctuary worked very hard to keep all of the foliage cut down and so that the zebras could see in every direction, because the idea was that they're prey animals, and so they want to be able to see if there's potential predators lurking around. But you also made me think of a chapter that's in, just to give a plug to another good book, The Ethics of Captivity, which you edited, which by Miriam Jones, where she talks about really trying to think through how to balance safety for chickens. She's writing about chickens who want to roost in trees at night versus the agency that you could afford animals to figure it out on their own. So instead of just deciding humans hands off, like laissez-faire, whatever happens to the animals, it's their lives, there was this sort of balancing of, well, if the chickens run away when you reach up, then that's some kind of sign that they're aware of potential predators, and maybe they're ready to be up there if they really don't want to come into the coop at night. And there will be a risk, and there might be a danger, and maybe a raccoon will get one of the chickens, but the chickens also got the opportunity to decide where they were going to sleep like they wanted to. And so, yeah, I could see the same thing playing out with the cow and the goat example, where, or if anybody who has two dogs, that you watch them figure out how to get along with each other. And at first it sounds like they're maybe going to have a nasty fight, and then you realize they're just working out dog politics and they're fine after a minute. And so, yeah, that trying to find that in between. And I think that a lot of sanctuaries, I think very understandably, see like one of their primary responsibilities as making sure that the animals in their care don't get injured and have good lives and aren't put at risk and in danger. And so I can totally understand why people fall in different places along that spectrum of trying to balance safety versus autonomy. And sometimes, like, I think examples all of good sanctuaries differ on this and have different approaches. And I don't think any of them are like doing it wrong or doing it right, per se.
I think that's right. I think that, I think that the role between safety and agency is just a difficult one that's worth always sort of keeping in the front of our minds and keeping in the front of those who are engaged directly with animal care and sanctuaries is a struggle. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking when you were saying that, that there about just introductions amongst chimpanzees is really, really challenging. They're very intensely hierarchical and strong and violent. And so there's a lot of difficult disagreement amongst different chimpanzee sanctuaries in this country about the best way of trying to allow chimpanzees to be with other chimpanzees, to be with a larger number of chimpanzees, but also allowing them to meet new chimpanzees. And that can be a really dangerous and frightening experience, both for the chimpanzees, but particularly for the caregivers who are having to sort of, as you say, sit and hope that there's going to not be too much damage that the chimps do to one another. It's a really problematic thing that happens on a regular basis. I wonder if you could give us examples of some of the other ways, some of the other real tensions that you observed while you were doing your ethnographic work at these different sanctuaries.
Well, yeah, one I wanted to talk with you about, because I know you've seen this play out in the chimpanzee context as well, is another issue around autonomy. So it's how to balance maximizing the sort of psychological well-being of animals. They're what's sometimes referred to as enrichment, but it's not just that they're in safe places now and they get the food and water that they need, but like I guess it's another way of sort of mitigating the impacts of captivity. You could imagine animals getting all of their sort of basic needs met and still being quite miserable. I saw a fox at a pseudo sanctuary early in my research who was in a small enclosure, and she just was constantly running in a circle. That's like really kind of intense neurotypical behavior. And so I think that's also a huge concern. Sanctuaries are trying to find ways to not have that impact on animals as much as possible. And for many species, reproduction is like a really valuable aspect to their species being. Birds love to brood, love to hatch eggs. And at the same time, sanctuaries, because of these finite spaces with limited resources, have a strong incentive to not allow reproduction inside the sanctuary space. Also, there's an idea that they shouldn't be doing it because, especially if they're rescuing animals from this endless pool of suffering animals out there, that like you're giving up a space that could be to a rescued animal if you're breeding even more, or you're allowing more animals to reproduce, not breeding. But and so I think that that's like another one of those complicated dilemmas to navigate. I know that sometimes sometimes it happens either through choice. Sanctuaries decide anyway, like maybe it's a good idea that these chickens can have a few chicks or these birds can have a few babies because it means more to them than it's going to be for the cost of feed. And then sometimes by accident, because if you have a bunch of animals, you have to, well, maybe you can speak to this, the difficulty with chimpanzees, like it's sometimes very hard to stop animals from reproducing if they want to.
Well, I think in the chimpanzee case, it's particularly complicated because chimpanzees can live up to 50 years or sometimes longer. And it's not the facilities that one needs to safely care for chimpanzees very expensive. So, and there's a limited amount of spaces for chimpanzees. And so the idea that chimpanzees might be able to reproduce and enjoy their full agency, as it were. And I think it's really important to make I want to make a distinction in this case that sort of whether or not animals reproduce is very different than whether they have sex. As it turned out, surprisingly to me, I didn't realize that, at least in the chimp world, chimps need to be taught how to have sex. I didn't realize this. So there are chimps that came from laboratories isolated that did not know how to have sex. So that's a whole nother thing. But for the chimps that do know how, in the chimp sanctuary like Chimp Haven that I was speaking about at the beginning, there is a procedure that the veterinarians perform vasectomies on the male chimpanzees in order to prevent reproduction so that they could still have sex but not be reproductive. As it turns out, many male chimpanzees can grow back their vas deferens, the cords that lead to, that are typically clipped in a vasectomy. So what ended up happening at Chimp Haven is there were what they call oopsie babies. So there's a number of these young chimpanzee babies that are unbelievably sort of appealing. They're unbelievably appealing to humans. They're unbelievably appealing to other chimpanzees. And it genuinely enriched the social lives of the chimpanzees. But it's not the case that this is a good thing. I don't think that the sanctuaries had a number of these where they don't know that the vasectomy there's one particular chimpanzee who had to have a vasectomy 3 times. He was really into having offspring somehow, both physiologically and who knows, psychologically. But the offspring that existed, these oopsie babies, really brought a tremendous amount of pleasure and joy and fulfillment and meaning to the whole group of chimpanzees, not just the parents of the chimpanzees. So it does raise really, I think, tricky questions about whether to curtail just the dilemma that you're raising, being able to fulfill all of the sort of important interests or needs or desires that one has in captivity, at the same time, the push against the kind of fiscal and ethical pressures, and to some extent political pressures, that would make it so that we have to limit that particular agential capacity, as it were.
I think one other tiny aspect to that also, or another small aspect to that, is I don't have expertise in specific species very much. I just kind of absorbed what I learned from caregivers. But there was an example of the zebras at this one sanctuary I was at, where the caregiver there, the main caregiver there, told me that zebras mellow out a lot. If female zebras will mellow out a lot after they become mothers. And so to the extent that it would make caring for them less dangerous and they would be more gentle around people, there was real consideration that maybe allowing a female zebra who not yet had children have one offspring, so that it would be easier to do the care work, was like another factor that went into it. Because zebras they're not like horses. They are very aggressive in defending themselves, and they will charge head on and bite and kick and kind of attack in a different way. So whenever we were in there feeding the zebras, we were supposed to be very calm and stay off to the side and not get in the zebra space.
That's a really interesting sort of conundrum, whether or not to allow the animals to do some capacity in order to make the care for them easier for the humans. This is always, I think, the site of the most challenging ethical questions is, what is the purpose of this decision? Why are we doing this action? Is this for the well-being of the animal? Is this for the well-being of the caretakers? Is it for both? Sometimes it's for both, in which case I think there's probably a greater justification for that intervention or allowance, if you will. But if it's just for the caretakers, I wonder, that raises some interesting, real, I think, challenging questions about their captive conditions. And I think this comes up in thinking about letting other people come visit sanctuaries, outside people come into the sanctuary. As you were saying earlier, providing animals that are in sanctuary with privacy, the ability to avoid humans if they'd like to avoid humans, allowing them to make the most robust choices they can make within the constraints of both the fiscal and the ethical and the political and spatial constraints of the humans that are taking charge. And that, I think, raises some interesting questions, at least for me, about how to imagine ourselves in solidarity with animals, with their captive animals on sanctuary. And I wonder I know you write a little bit about that, and I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be in solidarity with other animals. And I wonder if you want to start us off thinking about that as
I'm also really fascinated with this idea. I think it's kind of where I go in the conclusion, is trying to think about what like a broader interspecies solidarity could be and how sanctuaries can really contribute to that. And I was initially going off of the idea that Kendra Coulter came up with in her writing about animals in labor. And she talks about the potential for interspecies solidarity to encourage, and this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about what sanctuaries can do, encouraging new ways of thinking and acting individually and collectively, like across, intersectionally among humans, but also across species boundaries, and sort of developing this multi-species politics that sees diverse people and animals can seek like forms of justice together. So I think there's a kind of, multiple ways of thinking about it. I think that there's the kind of interspecies solidarity that can be forged within the sanctuary space, which I think is somewhat contingent on the way that the human caregivers are perceiving animals as subjects. So there's like a very paternalistic way that care can be given. And then there's a sort of where the animals are, and I don't think this is like influenced by any kind of negative intentions, but where animals can be seen as sort of infantilized, like the equivalent of babies or children who are in human care. And then there's an approach where the animals are being treated as individual adult residents of this community. And if you're thinking about it as a community, then that creates a sort of a foundation for different ways of relating to the animals, which of course influences all the decisions we were just talking about as far as how you weigh things like safety and agency. If you're making that decision for an adult whose space you're coming into 8 or 10 hours a day to help out, but like it's their home, you're going to come to different conclusions than if you see it as a bunch of babies in your care, like a daycare center or something. But I also think that there's a way in which the solidarity really applies to like a sanctuary's role in the community. Like, to give a great example is Vine Sanctuary in Vermont does all kinds of community-based work as far as having a seed library at the local library and classes, educating people about how to feed themselves plant-based diets that are like how to, develop like cuisine that you want to build your menus around at home and plan for and stuff, and supporting other social justice movements in the community. So like coming out and being a part of the Black Lives Matter protests, was it 2 summers ago now? And other ways like that. But I want to hear also what you have been thinking in ways of solidarity.
Yeah, let me just, I'll be brief so that we can hear from other people in the room. But one of the things that I think is really interesting in terms of farmed animal solidarity, for example, is the possibility of working with farmers. And I know that there's been talk of this at Vine Sanctuary in Vermont. And I know that Mercy for Animals has been actually doing some of this, but I think there's a tremendous space for being in solidarity with farmers to try to transition from farming animals to farming plants and being in solidarity. I mean, in Vermont, there's a tremendous problem with workers in dairies being underpaid and exploited and not getting time off. So to somehow build community, not just with, as you said so brilliantly, the animals as adults, not infantilized beings that are sort of needing our special attentive care, but being in solidarity with these other grown beings, but also being in solidarity with workers in industries that we may object to as people who support, let's say, farmed animal sanctuaries. So I think that there's a complicated but really important political opening for building solidarity across these kinds of exploitative differences. And we can imagine that one way that this could happen is to get people who are working in the dairy industry to understand what dairy cows what their lives end up looking like when they're not in that exploitative industry. And then also supporting them in getting different kinds of jobs with better working conditions. So that's just one example that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of building larger coalitions around shared interests that include ending exploitation and abjection of animals, but also recognize the roles that workers play in advanced capitalist exploitation and other areas. So I think that that's really important.
Can I jump in, just add real quickly? Like, I think that's such an excellent point. And I would also apply that to slaughterhouse workers. I was doing some research for an article with a friend or colleague last year, and she posted on social media to just ask for recommendations for articles about the conditions that, like the psychological impact on slaughterhouse workers and for our research. And some vegans or animal rights activists, or I don't know who they were, but they were like vegan accounts, got angry and were like, why do you care about these people? They're doing this horrible stuff. Like, I'm so sick of hearing animal people talk about the humans. We should be doing this for the animals. And I think, I like understand where that impulse is coming from for people in animal activism. But I think the ethos of sanctuary, this idea of caring for others, can really extend to that kind of solidarity, can inform the broader movement around the kind of solidarity forging that needs to happen. I think industrial animal agriculture treats the humans that work for in that industry as meat also. Like, if you look at the impact of COVID on slaughterhouse workers in the last 2 years, they were just being thrown in like figuratively thrown into the meat grinder, and the companies knew it and didn't care. They wanted to, keep the lines running. So I think that there's like that sanctuaries can really contribute to shaping the sort of broader ethos of activism and solidarity building too.
Great. Well, maybe we should stop recording and we can ask if there's any conversation and questions or comments.
Sure thing. I'm going to stop the recording now.